Hello, boys and girls, and moms and dads. Glad to be back with you today. And today we're going to read a section from the Big Picture Story Bible, beginning at part 6. So if you want to watch the screen, you can follow along and see the pictures, or if you have your own Big Picture Story Bible, you can flip the pages and see them there as well. We're going to read the story today that leads us up to the time of Moses, and we will see what happened after uh, the life of Joseph that we talked about Sunday. And this section is entitled God's People Become Great. So let's see what we can learn today. Jacob moved his growing household to Egypt. Bags were packed, camels and donkeys were loaded with things, and everyone started out. First came Jacob, the son of Isaac, the grandson of Abraham. Next came Jacob's sons, and then came all their families. 70 people moved to Egypt. By now, God's promise of a great people was really growing. And God's promise kept growing long after Jacob and his sons died. After 400 years in Egypt, God's people had grown into a great nation named Israel. In fact, Israel had so many people that the land was filled with them. Do you think the Egyptians liked having all these people in their land? Pharaoh, the king of the land, hated the people of Israel. Pharaoh hated Israel's God too. So he treated God's people like slaves. He made them work, work, work. He was so evil that he even killed some of God's people. God's people were in trouble, and they cried out to God for help, and God heard them. Do you see that little baby boy? He was God's answer to the people's cry for help. His name was Moses, and one day he would rescue God's people. When Moses grew up, God spoke to him. Moses listened to God, and then Moses did what God told him to do. He went to Pharaoh and said God's words, "Let my people go." But the king said no. He did not listen to God. Moses told Pharaoh that if he disobeyed God's word, terrible things would happen to the Egyptians. Did that make the king decide to listen to God? Nope. Pharaoh still refused to let God's people go. So God made the river turn to blood. The entire land swarmed with frogs, and dust turned into gnats. But Pharaoh still refused to let God's people go. So God made the houses full of flies. The animals of Egypt got sick and died, and the people got painful sores. But Pharaoh still refused to let God's people go. So God made hail fall from the sky. Locusts covered the ground, and darkness spread out over the land. But Pharaoh still refused to let God's people go. Can you imagine what it would take for Pharaoh to let God's people go? God's great sign. God gave Moses a message for his people. Moses told God's people to take lambs and sacrifice them. He told them to put the blood over their front doors. The blood of the lamb was God's great sign. That night, the Lord took the lives of the firstborn in homes that did not have God's great sign. Many Egyptians died that night. But the Lord did not take the lives of the firstborn in homes that had blood over their doors. God passed over the families of Israel. At last, Pharaoh stopped pretending to be God. He listened to God and told God's people, "Go." Can you see the grandpas and grandmas, the men and women, the children and grandchildren, and the flocks and herds all going? God did keep his promise to Abraham. He did make him into a great nation. And when God's people left Egypt, there were almost 1 million of them. Do you know what God did next? God gave this great nation his good word. Moses went up on a mountaintop to meet with God. The mountain shook and lightning flashed. God spoke to Moses, and then Moses told the people all that God had said. Moses told them how to love God. Moses told them how to love others. Moses told them how to live as God's people. And to make sure that no one would forget, Moses had God's word written down in God's holy book. But do you know what happened? something sad. God's people still forgot God's word. Many of them doubted that God's word was good. Many of them disobeyed God's word. Many of them did not let God be king over them. So God punished his people. He made them live in the desert for a long, long time. But after 40 years, God was ready to keep another part of his promise. God was ready to bring his people into their own place. And we will get to talk about that, boys and girls, after we look at the story of Moses. But I want to ask you a question that you can talk about with moms and dads. Why do you think God made the Israelites kill a lamb and put the blood over the doorpost? Does that teach us something about what God was doing? Are there other ways that God kept his promises to his people as he preserved them in Egypt and brought them out of the land? Talk about these things with your mom and dad, and I look forward to seeing you again Sunday when we all can get together in church. I love you, boys and girls, and I hope to see you soon. God bless.